Good morning for some of you, good afternoon for most of you. Welcome to the Hot Politics Lab. I was thinking about how many meetings we've already had, but I'd lost count, and I guess that's a good thing. Welcome, everyone. It's not much of a meeting today. It's more like a mini conference because we have 3 different speakers today, and we'll have brief 30-minute presentations for each of the speakers. And so I won't waste a lot of time in presenting the huge CVs of our speakers today. We will first have Lala Muradova. Then we will have we will first have Tobias Rohrbach, then Lala Muradova, and finally Dante Della Gatta presenting. Let me first introduce to you Tobias. He will give a talk of about 10 minutes, after which you can ask questions. You can write them into the Q&A box that is below in the middle of your screen, and Bert Bakker will read them out. And then Tobias obviously has the chance to answer them. Let me briefly introduce Tobias to you. He is doing a joint PhD program, partly at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland and partly at the University of Amsterdam at the Department of Political Science. And so he's also a member of the Hot Politics Lab. And today he will present joint work about how differences in candidate evaluations, difference between men and women in terms of candidate evaluations. Without further ado, I want to give you the floor, Tobias.
Okay, thank you. So you should be able to see my presentation now, and I'm super happy to be able to present you for the first time ever the preliminary results of our meta-analysis of media-based candidate evaluations. So this was a meta-analysis that I conducted together with Louis Aldering and Daphne van der Pas, who are also present in the audience, I believe. So our meta-analysis really is at the center stage of what Karen Ross calls the game of 3 sides, with the 3 sides being the media, gender, and voters. And of course, there are these kind of dyadic interactions between all of these concepts. But what the literature on gender mediation is usually interested in is this more abstract causal chain, which looks something like a vicious cycle where the media misrepresent women and men politicians in the coverage, and voters then kind of misperceive women and men politicians based on these gender differences in the coverage, which then kind of leads to a perpetuation of the status quo, because women, because of these kind of combined disadvantages, are being kept out of elected positions. So the goal of our meta-analysis is to kind of bring together all the available evidence on this abstract causal chain, and to find out when and how gender differences in media coverage lead to gender differences in voters' evaluations of political candidates. And to do so, we kind of need to bring together different disciplines and various subfields. So the first subfield is kind of the tradition of candidate choice experiments, which investigate the impact of gender on voter evaluations. So the main conclusion from 2 recent meta-analyses is that voters aren't really systematically biased against women candidates under these neutral kind of lab conditions. A second research field, however, comes to a rather different conclusion. And this field looks at gender differences in actual media content. And here, there is this finding of persisting gender differences in the kind of coverage that women candidates receive. So, for example, women candidates tend to receive more coverage of their physical appearance and looks, more coverage of their personality traits as opposed to their political issues, so what they actually stand for as politicians, and their personal life tends to receive more attention than that of their male counterparts. And I think this is important because it tells us that we cannot simply take the findings from these candidate choice experiments and transfer them to the context of evaluations of media coverage, because media do not present men and women candidates in a neutral way, and not in the same way either. So what we need to do is we need to kind of bring these subfields together and reconcile them. And we suggest doing this by kind of reconceptualizing this as media moderated candidate evaluations. So the direct effect of gender on voter evaluations is moderated by different aspects of media coverage, such as personalization coverage or such as trait coverage. With this framework, then we can kind of ask three main questions. So what overall gender effect is there for which evaluation outcomes? And finally, and this is most important for us here today, how are these effects moderated by different aspects of media coverage? So what we did is conduct a systematic information search kind of based on the standard PRISMA guidelines for meta-analysis, where the study selection was guided by four main eligibility criteria. So first, studies had to look at candidates in a political context, as opposed to candidates for job interviews or for kidney donations or heart transplants, which there's a lot of research about. Second, because we're interested in a particular kind of causal inferential framework, we only included experimental designs that had at least two factors. So one factor had to be kind of obviously a gender comparison, and the second factor had to be what we call a media moderator. So one aspect of media coverage that is manipulated. For example, feminine trait coverage of men and women politicians versus masculine trait coverage. Third, the stimulus material had to reflect what we call a journalistic decision. So the aspect of media coverage that is manipulated had to reflect something that is within journalists' control when they write a newspaper report. This most notably excludes candidate self-presentation strategies, as those are beyond journalistic control. And finally, the study had to include some kind of candidate evaluation as a dependent variable. So we ended up with 43 studies containing roughly 600 evaluations from a bit more than 15,000 participants. And well, this is the PRISMA flow diagram that I'm just gonna skip. We coded these studies on the level of the publication, on the level of the individual study, and as the smallest unit of coding on the level of the effect size. So we defined an effect size as the single gender comparison per evaluation outcome and experimental condition. So every study yielded several effect sizes for all of its experimental conditions and evaluation outcomes. Since we've literally just now finished the data collection this week, we haven't really been able to run a full comprehensive data analysis. But what we did do is run a series of Bayesian random effect models with weakly informative priors for various subgroups. So the subgroups here are the media moderators. And let's jump right to the preliminary results. So this figure here shows all the summary effects for all the media moderators that we found in our study. And what we see here, conceptually speaking, are moderation effects. So not main effects of gender and not main effects of media coverage, but kind of the moderation thereof. So positive effects indicate that indicate a gender difference in the moderation that is more favorable for women, and negative effects state that a given media moderator hurts women more than men in the evaluation. So what don't we see? Well, we don't see the negative effects that we kind of would have expected based on our theory, or based on theory for trade coverage. Actually, covering agentic traits in the media is more beneficial for men candidates than it is for women candidates than it is for men candidates. Also, we don't find a negative effect of covering women candidates' children or family background. We do find, however, a series of positive moderation. So for a series of aspects of media coverage that all have to deal with negativity in some way is associated with positive gender differences. For example, covering the appearance of candidates in a negative way, or just negative tonality overall, covering candidate scandals or their attacking behavior. All these aspects of media coverage lead to gender differences that are positive for female candidates. So, or at least they are hurt by that less severely than men candidates. It can be deceiving to only look at the summary effects at this very aggregated level. So that's why I suggest to kind of dive deeper into some of the actual effect size data that we find for some of the effects. So this forest plot shows all the effect sizes for all the negative tone conditions broken down for different outcomes. And we can see that this is kind of very homogeneous and that there's not much going on here, basically. However, this second forest plot is very different. It's much messier, and it shows all the effect sizes for scandalization coverage, basically. And what I did here is group the effect sizes according to evaluation outcomes. And then we can see some kind of pattern. So the top half of the plot shows trade outcomes. But women involved in scandals seem to be punished less severely than men candidates when their personality traits are being evaluated. However, if we look at this midsection, we can see that the exact opposite is true when we look at viability outcomes. So covering candidate scandals leads to kind of more, or diminishes the evaluation of women candidates' viability more than for men. But this kind of viability punishing effect doesn't really extend to vote preference outcomes, where we don't really see this negative effect, but much more positive effects. So this is interesting, and I think we need to spend a bit more time thinking about this. But that seems to be some kind of pattern. It feels a bit uncomfortable to be talking about any conclusions at this stage because it's very preliminary, but we do find some evidence of this media moderation idea. However, the evidence we find doesn't really reflect what we expected to find. We expected to find these negative moderation effects for trade coverage, for personalization coverage, but what we ended up finding are kind of positive effects for all these negative coverage styles that seem to benefit women more than men, or at least they seem to hurt women less than men. This may ultimately boil down to the fact that we may need to kind of rethink this general narrative of the vicious mediation cycle and make it a tad more positive. But before we can kind of make this very kind of strong statement, I think we have to we have to continue our analysis and do all the sensitivity analyses. We have to find a way to manage the heterogeneity and the scope of our results to kind of filter out the main contribution of our study and kind of gain a bit in clarity on that. And if you have any suggestions or tips, we're more than happy to hear about your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, Tobias, let's round up here. Thanks. Yes, so those of you who are new here, questions can be asked by typing your question in the Q&A box, so not in the chat, in the Q&A box. while you might be writing up your question, I'm going to ask you a first question, Tobias. I think meta-analysis are great, and I like the transparency that you're outlining here. I was wondering how your selection criteria. So you follow this sort of common scheme, but what wasn't clear to me is how you're dealing with publication bias here, because I can imagine that the gender experiments that don't work, that they end up in the file drawer. And so are we now looking at the effects of the biased literature, or are we, and if you have any sort of a priori specified way of how you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Publication bias is, of course, kind of a curse for every meta-analysis, and apart from kind of the statistical ways of assessing the possibility of publication bias, what we tried to do when when conducting the information search is including or specifically trying to include unpublished work by contacting authors, by extracting citations wherever possible, by being kind of open for serendipitous tips and hints by other people. So we try to really search as thoroughly as possible and not only focus on kind of the standard sources. So we also looked at databases for gray literature, where unpublished results might be, stuff like that. However, my kind of general intuition is that many of the studies actually are kind of contradicting one another at some time. So I'm not sure that researchers are kind of incentivized to only publish results of bias against or for women. I feel like if you run an experimental study in this kind of a field, I think you might want to, well, every result is interesting in that case. If we find no bias, then that's also something that you can frame very nicely, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the evidence for publication bias in the social sciences is, for me, quite convincing. That null findings don't get published. So the work by Annie Frankel, for instance, on the DES experiments show that especially experimental evidence with null findings don't get written up. So I'm a bit more skeptical than you are. But I think maybe turning to one of our earlier presenters, Amélie Godefroy, who did a meta-analysis and presented it here, as maybe also like reaching out a little bit more systematically to other people might be a thing you want to do to make sure that you get that publication bias out of your estimate as best as you can. Gijs, you also had a question, you told me.
Yeah, well, that was your question, but luckily I had a second one. I was wondering how well comparable female and male political candidates are, because on average, we have more male candidates, and on average, they are more highly placed on party lists, for example. So how does that play out in your analysis?
It doesn't, to be completely frank, in the sense that we kind of look at the ceteris paribus logic, where we have a woman and a man politician in the experimental kind of material that where everything else is held constant, I guess. So there was this was actually one argument at the early stage of the kind of when we conceived the meta-analysis, whether we wanted to include observational studies as well, because they are able to deal with this kind of slanted distribution of politicians way better. Well, this would have kind of resulted in a very messy sample. So we've decided to focus on the kind of clear-cut experimental designs. But your input is very relevant. I mean, we cannot really account for that with our data.
Okay, the next question is from Matthijs Roduin. Fascinating study, Tobias. Not 100% sure if I understood it correctly, but this is what I understood from your conclusion. You expected negative moderation effects of trade coverage in the media on the effect of gender on candidate evaluations, but instead you found the opposite. My question, how is that possible? Could you elaborate a little bit more on why this might be the case?
Yeah, I think that's, from a theoretical point of view, an interesting question. So the negative expectation would kind of result from this idea that emphasizing kind of communal traits is what happens most often, and when you emphasize agentic traits in the media, well, that kind of clashes with gender stereotypical expectations. This is why we expect a negative result. So finding a positive effect of agentic traits may simply mean that emphasizing agentic traits is positive for every politician, because that's kind of what politicians need to have to be successful in the perception of voters. So we just think that this kind of overlap between agentic traits and politicians' required skills is also boosting women's, it allows for women to kind of compensate their gender stereotypical lack of agency, I guess. That was a bit convoluted as an explanation, sorry, but I think that's kind of what's going on here. So this overlap of agency with the perception of what politicians should do, basically.
Okay, next question is from Sanne van Oosten. Hi Tobias, thank you for doing this important work. I think you do a good job in finding common ground amongst various studies. To me, it makes for clarity in a sea of literature, and I would love to cite your work when it's done. You ask how to deal with heterogeneity. Have you considered using, I don't know, I'm not familiar with this term, Sanne, Bojat plots to visually see what your outliers are, and funnel plots to visualize the extent to which publication bias is likely to be a problem?
Yeah, definitely the funnel plots. I mean, again, to be fair, I have to say at this stage, I haven't really had the appropriate time to look carefully at all the data. But funnel plots, yeah, I've plotted one just last night to kind of get a first idea. And thank you also for the bloodshot plots suggestion. I haven't done that yet, but I will do so. I think what I'm kind of worried about is just not so much the heterogeneity in general, but more the kind of how to fit all of this within kind of one narrative, you know. So how do we bring kind of all these very diverse results and sometimes at first sight confusing results within one narrative? How do we kind of make an argument that accounts for all of this? So this is kind of the next challenge after assessing the heterogeneity in statistical terms.
Thank you. I have another question.
Please.
I understand that you delve into the moderation immediately, but to me, I think it might be worth to first figure out what the main effects are, because yeah, the conditional effect is interesting, but it seems that unless you really have no main effect expectation, but then then I would like to know a little bit more specific what then the a priori moderation effect exactly is, it in the absence of an average main effect. And just in general, I think showing then the main effect or the absence of it might be relevant. But so the question is, why immediately focus on the interaction effect?
Yeah, the way we kind of conceived the meta-analysis was as being complementary to existing meta-analyses on either the direct effect or of gender, or the kind of the gender bias within media coverage. So we want to kind of to build the bridge. This is why we directly kind of focus on the moderation aspect of it. But we did capture main effects as well. so kind of the control group effects in a way. So we can look at those, and I think you're right, we should, to kind of establish the baseline to see what's happening.
Yes, yeah, I agree with that. Well, if there are no final questions, then I take the freedom to ask one more last question.
Can I ask a question, Bert?
Yeah, sure, that's also possible.
What about the statistical power of these moderation tests that you're using in a meta study?
Mm-hmm. So are you talking about like the observed power or the kind of calculated power beforehand?
Well, I assume most people haven't published their a priori power calculation, or have never done it. But you know, I've recently become quite concerned about the power of interaction effects. So that's why I'm asking the question.
Okay. To be fair, I haven't really given that much thought since I haven't really, well, I did find interaction effects, so I haven't really thought about looking whether the power is adequate or not. That's definitely something I have to do moving on with the analysis, and kind of making sure that the analysis is sound. That's definitely something I need to include in the analysis. But I can't really give you a satisfying answer as to it's underpowered, it's overpowered, or it's adequately powered. Sorry.
No, that's fine. It's just a thing I think you should consider. I mean, if results are all over the place, then one straightforward explanation could be that in some cases the research design wasn't proper.
But that actually would actually call for the importance of the meta-analysis, right? If you would then bring everything together, because these individuals...
the meta-analysis would eventually weed out these underpowered results, because they also get less weight in the meta-analysis, right? But I can see how this initially would just add to the noise that you're looking at or something.
To this messiness,
yeah.
Thank you.
All right. It's 3:30, so I'm going to announce the next speaker, Lala Muradova, PhD researcher at the Catholic University of Leuven. Although I've heard you've submitted your dissertation, so you're in this, or have you defended already too? No.
No.
Okay, so you're in this in between period, not yet a postdoc, but still a PhD. Lala's work is about a lot of different things, I should say, but I guess her main passion is to analyze the role of empathy in interpersonal deliberations. But that's not exactly what you're going to talk about today, right? No. Okay. So I'll just give you the floor and introduce your topic.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Just going to share screen. Right. Thanks a lot for having me. So this is a collaborative project with Jane Suter and Eileen Culotti from Dublin City University. And it's nothing to do with my PhD thesis, just side project. So the onset of COVID-19 health crisis basically brought with itself also worrying and alarming levels of misinformation and disinformation about different aspects of the virus. It's of course worrying because this kind of misinformation can have behavioral consequences, right? For example, some studies started to show that it might have consequences for, it might decrease the willingness to wear masks, for example, or willingness to get a vaccine when the vaccine is available, especially in the context of the US. So that's why it's very important to kind of study what to do so we can correct these misperceptions among the public. So there's this really nice literature on factual corrections, and they show that it's possible in not on all cases, but it is possible sometimes to correct people's misperceptions by exposing them to factual information. And most of these studies typically rely on expert sources. And what we argue in this paper that COVID is kind of a unique crisis or health crisis because it's overly politicized, and that's why, because of this nature, maybe perceptions of expert trustworthiness become a bit complicated. So what we do here, we basically bring two literatures together, we combine them, it's misinformation literature, and we bring democratic theory, which might seem a bit strange to you, but I will explain to you why. So it's specifically deliberative democratic theory, which basically puts interpersonal communication at the heart of political decision-making. It says that if a group of randomly chosen citizens come together, just lay citizens come together to talk about the issue, they learn from experts, they discuss the issue in depth, and the whole process can lead to better and more reflective political judgments and can even correct misperceptions. So one of these type of interpersonal communication is structured and institutions, they're called deliberative mini-publics. And they're actually now increasingly being used by governments to tackle complex problems such as abortion, same-sex marriage, and climate change all around the world. So the empirical studies up to now, though, have looked into how kind of small group deliberation can correct people's misperceptions. However, these people, so these citizens usually are participating citizens. So the question that we're asking, how about, wide-reaching effects? How about those citizens who do not participate in these events? Can these effects be scaled up to them, such to the wider kind of society? More specifically, we look into, can deliberative mini-publics, so can just reading about it or watching a video about it, hearing about it, can correct misperceptions about coronavirus. So what we do here, we fielded two studies. So first of all, I'll talk about the arguments. You can ask why, right? So the argument is that we believe deliberative mini-publics can act as credible source as a correction source to citizens. So why, you can ask? So we believe there are several kind of pathways, causal mechanisms underlying these relationships. First of all, these citizens are lay citizens, so they're not politicians, they don't have interests, so they can be perceived as non-partisan and less biased by citizens. And the second is similarity concept. So basically, because seeing these citizens are not experts, not politicians again, so they may perceive them as more similar to them. So the argument, like me, these people are like me, so I do trust them more. And the third pathway could be that because these deliberative mini-publics, basically people spend time together, they learn from experts and from each other, they can be perceived as enlightened versions of ourselves. So if we had time, we could learn from experts and from each other, then we could have more competence. So basically these people are perceived to have more competence. So to study these questions, we fielded two studies, and the first was conducted in June 2020, and it was a cross-national survey experiment fielded in the US and Ireland with descriptively representative sample, and we applied between and within subject design. And then we replicated it recently in October 2020 with a survey experiment in the US, and more or less the same experimental design with slight changes that I will explain to you later. Okay, so we kind of focused on one specific false claim. It's about the origin of the virus. That virus is man-made and was released from a lab. Okay, and the design more or less in a simplistic term was like this. So they took a short pre-experimental survey where we, apart from measuring lots of covariances, we also measured their beliefs about false and correct items, claims about coronavirus. And one of them was this claim that I have showed to you. And then they were randomly assigned to control condition, to citizen correction condition, which I call basically, I talked about deliberative mini-public. I will explain you more. And then to make it comparable, to see if its effectiveness can be compared to effectiveness of expert correction, we also had some kind of placebo condition, expert correction condition. And then we measured mediators and outcome variables, etc. Okay, so our stimuli was a very short video. This is for expert condition. So it's a virologist, and he debunks, basically in 51 seconds, debunks the false claim. And then we had for deliberative mini-public, we had this also video about online deliberation, because of course we couldn't do it, you know, about small group offline deliberation, because it wouldn't have made sense in the COVID age. So so we had this basically very short information. It's a bit larger than the previous one, 2 minutes and 10 seconds. And then we also showed the expert video, the same video that we showed, we also show here. So to make it comparable, and we say that they heard from experts, they discuss the matter, and then they debunk basically the false claim. Okay, so this kind of descriptive stats, it shows by country the group of people who are misinformed is quite large, actually. So if you see our island, 38% of people are misinformed about the origin of war, at least then in June. And in the US, it's more than 25%. And in the US case, as you would have expected, it varies by partisanship. So it's more than half of Republicans are misinformed, and much less for Democrats, etc. So I'm going to go through fast. You can always ask me questions later. Okay, so what we do, the analysis, we proceed the following way. So first of all, we look at mean raw change, so kind of net change, so within subject changes. After experimental stimuli, so this is by country and across experimental conditions. So you see that actually taking even the survey itself, control condition, they had changed their attitude. So basically positive changes denote towards correction, so changes happening towards correction of misperceptions, and vice versa. However, as you can see here, so Citizens Assembly condition basically had the largest effect, and then expert correction didn't work. So what we do next, you know, to make it more clear, we just recorded the variable change, made it categorical. And what you can see here again across countries, so green denotes a group of people, percentage of respondents who shifted their attitudes towards correcting misperceptions, and the blue one denotes percentage of people who actually had so-called backfire effect, which Reifler and Nairn in their seminal study call it. So they move towards the opposite side. So you can ask me later questions. I'll just go through quickly. So what you can see here that, I mean, the only effect was a citizen correction effect, so a deliberative mini-public effect, and it's substantial statistical significance. So it's 12% here when compared against control condition, 14% when compared against expert condition, and it's comparable to the US, more or less, US sample as well. And then in study 2, what we had, so we measured, I'll talk about the measurement later, but here what we did, so we thought maybe expert correction didn't have an effect, but citizen correction had, maybe because respondents basically perceived more consensus coming from deliberative mini-public video. And maybe it wasn't so obvious in the expert correction video. So we just added like several seconds of basically showing that there was a scientific consensus on the expert video. And you can see that, you see both of them, expert correction and Citizens Assembly or so-called deliberative mini-public condition. Both of them had a positive effect on people's tendency to shift their post-experimental attitudes towards the correct side. And the same thing here. So you can see even the effect is larger. So we did the same, recorded the variable, and then those group, those who are in the green column, they moved, shifted towards the correct side, and the effects are 20% basically, and substantively and also statistically significant. But as you can see here, there's no difference between expert correction and deliberative mini-public correction, basically. Okay, so what are the main takeaways? That deliberative mini-publics perhaps can act as credible source of correction for COVID misperceptions. Just bear in mind, it's the first study that does it. So of course it's suggestive, so more studies need to be done. Findings on the effectiveness of expert corrections, however, mixed. And then what I didn't talk about, we also hypothesized in our pre-registration, hypothesized about moderation effect. So I can, if you have questions, I can talk more about it. I have graphs, and they were also mixed. So thank you very much. We're gonna conduct another experiment in Ireland. So I would be really happy if you could tell me some parts of the experimental design are not, I don't know, convincing. So what kind of things you can do in the future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Lala. Interesting work. Thanks for this clear presentation. I have two questions. One, if I understand it correctly, you ask within one survey sort of the same question about misperceptions twice, right?
Yes. So in the first one, we basically mixed it with, I think, 5 or 6 other claims. Some of them were false, others were about masks and washing hands, etc. And then after experiment, we asked about this specific question and about Bill Gates.
Yeah, so my first question is, like, what do you make of this sort of general change in the first experiment from between the two questions? Like, is that just random noise, or people became for some reason a little bit moved in a certain direction? Why is that within the same survey in a control condition? And so if I would have to do it again, I would wonder, like, is there an issue that you asked this in a short survey twice, or should you maybe do some sort of pilot wave 1 experiment and then a week of nothing, and then do this experiment with the corrections? Yeah. The second question I would have is to what extent are you worried that your expert corrections suffer from pre-treatment issues? So the extent that people are constantly exposed to experts like that tell stuff about the virus. Whether or not it's true or not, that's a different question, but there's constantly corrections on what is true and false in media. It must be in Ireland as well. In the US it is for sure. So does that affect your mixed findings on the expert commission?
Yeah. Okay, that's brilliant questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, the first one, I don't know, we can't really know, is the survey respondent effect, is a demand effect, or is it maybe because they took it and then they just, like, while taking the survey, they Googled it, or they thought about it more, they reflected about it more. At this point, unfortunately, I cannot know from the data that we have. So in the second, which is connected to the first one, of course, I think you're right. So it would have been better if there was like wave 1 and wave 2, or perhaps just between subject design. So which basically we wouldn't have, to measure a pre-experimental question. But I even think, so the effect size then maybe would have been bigger, because perhaps there's this cognitive consistency happening. So I answered this question this way, and I shouldn't, answer it differently, even though expert or another condition convinced me. So yeah, it's a very good idea. Maybe we will just conduct between subject design or something, or wave 1 and wave 2, and just see if it differs. And the third question is also very important one. I don't know, how can I know kind of questions that I can ask to see if it's the effect, what you have been talking about. What we asked, yes, we asked a trust battery, which one of the item is, do you trust in scientists? Maybe I can do subgroup analysis, or this wasn't registered though, so it will have to be exploratory analysis just to see if it differs across individuals' trust in experts. But can you think of any other way of accounting for it?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not an expert on this correction of misinformation literature, but I do have a sense that maybe correction of misperceptions in COVID is a difficult issue to study, because what I've seen from these misperception studies, they often, they are salient topics, but then they bring an expert like, well, actually say this about immigration, but experts say X, Y, Z. And here with COVID, you have this, you cannot turn on the TV, or there is somebody from a hospital telling you about how we should perceive the facts. So that might affect it. But there are actually a couple of questions, so let's move on to that. Wait. Oh, I'll read Sanne's question. Matthijs, I'll start with Matthijs' question, and then I'll go to Sanne's question. 2 questions. Could you say more about the backlash effect? Did you have any expectations beforehand about these? So that's the first. And the second question is about the moderation effects you mentioned. Have you taken into account variables like trust in science politics? So that's a good connection to what we were just talking about.
Have I taken into account what, sorry?
Trust in science.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so let's have a look at backlash effects. No, we didn't pre-register backlash effects, but it's just been poorly, exploratory. Okay, here. So yes, we do. So you see the blue ones are backlash effects in both countries, but I find the analysis show that they're not statistically significant, whether within subject or across subjects. But we didn't pre-register it as a hypothesis, but of course would have expected it perhaps from seminal study by Nyan and Reifler, 2010. But yeah, there's no significant effect here, although you can see it, but it's not systematic, basically. And then moderators, I'll just show you the okay, so here, what we did for registers is in terms of hypothesis is we thought these effects would differ across individual dispositional open-minded thinking, which we know from the literature, and conspiracy thinking or mentality, which we know from the literature as well. And in terms of the effect of mini public, we also pre-registered interpersonal trust and trust in citizens' assemblies, which is like a deliberative mini public. So I think so we do have a question, trust in scientists as well. I think I did run some analysis and there was nothing, but it's not here. So maybe I should look into that more.
Cool, thanks. Okay, next question is from Sanne. Dear Lala, thank you for this presentation of a uniquely topical subject. I've had the privilege of reading an earlier version of your paper and enjoyed reading it very much. I recommend all to read it as well. There was a time in the corona crisis, I believe in April, where the claim that coronavirus was man-made from the lab in Wuhan came from quite credible sources. Later it was debunked. It might be that some of your respondents already had the former or the latter information, or both, since these are experiments. I don't think it will change the outcome, but it might cause more noise. Have you measured what people's ideas were about the topic before as well?
Thank you very much, Sunny. That's a brilliant question. But yeah, no, the first study was conducted in June, basically. So before June, we wouldn't do any study. Would have been really interesting to have this information. Yeah, no, I mean, the next study was in October and it hasn't changed much. So I have descriptives here. Study 2 descriptives with the US only. So you can see that it hasn't dwindled. So it hasn't decreased actually. So between June and October. But I do understand your point about, April and being more exposed or exposed actually to credible sources. And we cannot capture it, unfortunately, with this with these studies. Thank you.
All right. Next question is from, I think, Haley. You should know, Haley, where to post the question in the chat. Wait, let me read it. Oh, it's also very long. Hi, Lala. Thank you for presenting. Super interesting. I really enjoyed reading this for the Politicologe. Great to hear more about it now. If I understood correctly, you showed participants in the Citizens Assembly condition a video of the mini-public, where with COVID-19, there's a great deal of discussion occurring online among citizens, and there are many who just observe rather than participate too. Here have you given any thought at all about perhaps using a stimuli which stimulates deliberative discussions online? In other words, social media comments sections, etc. Do you think you might find similar outcomes in such a scenario?
Oh, that's a very good idea. Maybe for the next experiment, so that just to have a look at the method effect, you know, whether just reading about it in the social media has a different or same effect from watching a video about it. It's a very good idea, actually. Yeah, I'll take that into account.
Cool. All right. Next question is from Diamantis Petropoulos Petalas. Hello, Lala, and thank you so much for sharing your research results with us. I wonder if the difference in the number of portraits people that the stimuli had plays any role in how much weight individuals attribute to opinions of others. In other words, would you expect the effects to reverse in a group of experts if a group of experts was shown compared to the single expert?
Right. Okay. Yeah, it could be the case. Well, it could be maybe if it's a group of experts, then the perceived consensus, which from the literature we know that a more scientific consensus increases the efficiency of corrections, and maybe then it could somehow increase the effect of expert. Yeah, that's true, because maybe it was one of the reasons why we changed slightly second study video. We added these sentence that there was a scientific consensus, whereas from the first one you couldn't tell. So yeah, it makes sense what you're saying. Thank you.
Hi, she also had a question.
Yeah, maybe more a suggestion. I was thinking it would be interesting to see the effect of the deliberative exercise if these people were not sharing the same sort of content that the expert is saying, but rather the fake news.
Oh, okay. So if it okay, so you think if you trust the Citizen Assembly, if they share a fake news, would people believe in that or not? Is that what? Yeah.
So if you're interested in the effects of these mini publics,
yeah.
But now there's a constant between experts and the mini public you're showing, and namely the information, right? And I mean, I can see that would be the first step to do. But would they still believe the mini publics if the mini publics are sharing nonsense stories?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think according to the theory, we're saying they would, but we don't have, because that's the thing. So we say that the people use it as a what's the word, facilitative trust in the literature, the Warren and Gastel. So shortcuts, you know, the way they use the Elliott shortcuts. And then according to the theory, it would make sense. But it would be really interesting what you say. I mean, it would be good to empirically tested and say.
I think it would be a harder test.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Next question is from Marie-Isabel Teuwis. Hi, Lala. You mentioned the causal mechanism leading to opinion change due to citizen deliberation. I didn't catch whether in the Citizen Assembly condition you found any evidence for one of these three causal pathways: impartiality, similarity, or competence.
Yes, so we asked in the second study only, in the first study, no, in the second study we asked some questions. So I'm just going to show you one. I didn't have time to do for all, but this is a similarity perception. So basically we asked a battery of questions. Do you perceive these people who are in the video similar to you, having a similar background to you? and the third, what was it, similar experience or something. And then because the control condition, we didn't show anything, no stimuli, I cannot control, like kind of compare it to the control condition. So here you can see that they did perceive. It's just a mean of perceived similarity. They did perceive those citizens deliberating more similar to them when compared against expert condition. So I don't have, so I haven't done the causal, mediating analysis. I'm also, because of the whole studies coming up, I'm not very sure if I should do that analysis and report it in the paper. But yeah, descriptively, that's what I can show you. And there was something to do with consensus and then impartiality and some other questions, about emotions as well that I can show you. So here, basically what I find that expert video made them frustrated and alarmed and a bit angry. So if you look into here, the Citizens Assembly video, on the other hand, it kind of increases some kind of feelings, like positive feelings. So yeah, we didn't hypothesize about emotional pathways, but this is just a kind of descriptive, which is interesting. We would like to explore it in the future. Why citizens make them, this kind of video make them more positive, and expert video makes them more alarmed or frustrated. Thank you.
Okay. So the last 2 minutes, I don't know. I was thinking about, you asked like, what should we do in a third study?
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe not add too many new things. Like there's already quite a few things happening here in 2 experiments, and getting this into, well, unless you're writing multiple papers, but if it's for 1 paper, I'm not sure if adding a lot of new things is what you should be doing. But that's just, I don't know how other people think about this, but I thought that's the last minute I'll share that thought. What do you think, Gijs?
I fully agree with you.
Oh, you okay?
No, I mean, it's always tempting, of course, to add a lot, but I'm assuming your budget is limited. So
yeah, it's my co-author's budget, not mine, but yeah.
Yeah.
But I think what we learn here from the psychologists that come and present here, they often present a series of studies which are very closely aligning to each other. And the political science audience that we're also, most of us here are partly trained in, they do like this new thing, which is different.
Yeah, so you would just replicate the same design.
Small changes, improvements, but it's about what's the main message in the end that you wanna communicate. And by adding all sorts of new moderators or treatments, you're adding whole new sections to the study. And
that too, and I think the difference between the expert condition and the mini public condition was already very small in study 1, and then you don't find it in study 2. Yeah. I'm pretty sure if you do study 3, you find it again, but maybe even in the reverse direction. It's just very little difference. Mm-hmm. And you would need a very large sample in order to reliably find a systematic difference, I'd say.
I think picking up on that, guys, I think that would be in a third study a well-powered test of the main effect to know if the argument is correct. That's probably what the study needs. The paper needs.
Okay, enough lecturing.
No, but I was just being, it's interesting. It's an interesting temptation that we also share here, is to do new things all the time.
Yeah. It's 4. So Lala, I want to thank you. Like Tobias, the previous speaker, you will get this the Hot Politics Lab coffee mug once we're allowed to cross borders again, and hand it to you personally. And so Tobias, this is yours too. And Dante, well, you still need to present, so you might get this one. Okay. Next and last presentation, quite a special presentation, I must say. Dante Della Gatta will do the presentation. It's a joint project that emerged last year. Dante is now, I guess, a third-year bachelor political science student. And last year he did Project 2, a course in the Bachelor of Political Science, and under the supervision of Maaike Homan. And with his group, they did an incredibly interesting experiment. And Maaike and I said, well, let's just throw some money at it and do a second and later on even a third study, but that still needs to be done. So for you, the audience now, especially the first two studies of this student project evolving into something much more than that. Dante, the floor is yours.
Indeed, thank you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my PowerPoint. You guys can all hear me all right, yeah? And see the PowerPoint presentation, great. Yeah, so as Gijs said, my name is Dante Della Gatta, and I'm presenting some research with the help of Maaike and Gijs and my fellow groupmates Victor, Izzy, and Liska. We've been exploring regarding emotion perception in politicians. 2020, of course, has been a year full of emotions in politics. We've been bombarded with images of politicians delivering remarks regarding the coronavirus crisis. And specifically, we saw this image. We grew really curious about the facial expressions of Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci standing behind the US President Donald Trump. This motivated us to dig a bit deeper into which emotions were on display and caused us to ask what, if any, facial expressions, facial features actually, if those played any roles in contemporary power politics. Of course, there's been an established an important role of emotions in politics. Specifically, it's been shown that certain visual politics play a crucial role. Namely, for us, we were most interested in the research that has shown the difference between the perceptions of men's and women's displays of emotions and those being perceived as different. We wanted to know if the difference played out also in power relations. And we wanted to know if there were certain stereotypes about sex influence that influence those emotional perceptions, those perceptions of emotions. In our research, we are aiming to examine the point of perception specifically, not necessarily the evaluation of emotional displays, but specifically the point of perception. And yeah, to clarify here, we kind of delineate between general power positions and dominant power positions. I'm gonna bring that up on the slide here. In general, we see that men are often seen as more angry, while women are seen as more happy or smiley. And we also see that facial expressions here tend to overlap, facial features, sorry, tend to overlap with expressions. We wanted to know also, of course, if this is the case in dominant positions. And what we see in the literature, at least, is that there's this switch that occurs. There's less anger being perceived in men who are holding positions of power as compared to women in power positions. They're often seen as more angry. And we wanted to know if this could be caused by sex stereotypes. And yeah, I'm going to explain to you what we did here. So in June, like Gijs said, we performed kind of this pilot study for our bachelor's program, and the results can be summarized in the graph here above on your screen. What we did find was that there was an effect which supports the notion that women were perceived as being more angry than their male counterparts in positions of power. But this, of course, was just a kind of a preliminary study, and we really wanted to see if these results would be found again. So what we did is we formulated a series of hypotheses to test. Our first hypothesis here is that there would be no difference in the anger perception in male versus female politicians with neutral expressions. Our second hypothesis would be that people perceive more anger in female politicians with a morphed angry expression than a male politician with an angry expression. I'm going to explain how we developed our design here in a minute. And our third hypothesis was an A/B hypothesis that sought to explore whether or not men or women have a stronger bias in anger perception of female politicians. So the way that we designed this study, initially actually used Qualtrics. Well, we used Qualtrics both times, but we used a survey, which in our convenience sample, or in our pilot study, we performed a convenience sample where we reached 124 participants. We, of course, revised the survey to fit into our current and second study, where we utilized the Amazon service mTurk to reach around 195 participants. Included in this design, there, of course, were attention checks. We collected some demographic data about age, gender, level of education. And in this survey, participants were asked to rate their emotions using a 7-point scale. You can see here we used actually 4 basic emotions based on the original 6. We took out 2 emotions because in the pilot study, we found that they were not often clicked. And of course, participants saw all these conditions in a randomized order. So from a pool of 42 pictures, each participant was shown a subset of both morphed photos and unmorphed photos. And we used a 2x2 within subject design with the neutral and manipulated photos to create this condition. And I'm going to show you how we did that next. So using, really hundreds of photos of MPs and lords from the United Kingdom, we selected some neutral faces. And from there, we further refined the pool using a program called Face Reader. This system basically would run the photo through and spit out a score for us. And we would only use those with a neutral score. So from there, we also further selected, we disregarded photos that had obviously weird facial features. For example, an open mouth would not work in the Face Reader. It wouldn't read it as neutral. And also photos needed to be taken from a straight on angle so that both participants would be able to see the emotion clearly and the Face Reader program. Our second step was to manipulate some of these photos into an angry expression. And we did this using a program called Psychomorph. What this did is it would reshape certain facial features so that these faces would show an angry expression. And Psychomorph isn't really perfect, so it kind of produces these images of people with wonky artifacts, as we call them. You've probably seen that on the social media where someone's lip or face or something gets a bit wonky. So we used Photoshop to actually go through and clean up each of these photos to make sure that participants wouldn't know that they've been retouched. Then we did one further round of validation, and we wanted to make sure that the Face Reader system would produce an angry score. And using this methodology, we were able to narrow down these hundreds of photos into a pool of usable photos, around 42 photos we had. So the main results of our second study go as follows. So here you can see that in our first hypothesis or our first condition, we found that anger is not significant, but there was a difference with happiness and sadness, which is somewhat in line with the theory that men are perceived as sad and women are perceived as happy. And this did indeed support our first hypothesis. Our second condition or second set of photos were the angry photos. And here the morphed photos show the same result. There's no difference in anger, but again, there's a difference in disgust and sadness, despite the manipulation for them to look angry. We start, of course, to question why this was the case, but we start to think that there might be difficulty for participants to differentiate between angry, disgusted, or sad. We'll come back to that in a bit, though. And finally, of course, we performed a regression and we added a few control variables, and we found the following. So you can see here that the neutral photos did not produce an effect. They almost did, but indeed they crossed that dotted line, so they did not. However, our results for H1 and H2, or I'm sorry, the angry photos did indeed produce a significant result, as you can see here. And those are going to support our first and second hypothesis. That's actually all I've got here. Micah, I'm sure you have lots of things to add to this, because Micah has kind of taken a large role in taking this research further.
Yeah, no, you did a great presentation. And just one thing that I want to add is that in general, if we control for all the control variables, we see indeed that there's this effect of when we have the same manipulations for female and male politicians, that we see that the female politicians are perceived as more angry than male politicians. And yeah, that's actually the main conclusion, but we have to do a third study to really replicate this and go into it a little bit further. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so do you guys have any questions?
Well, I'm first gonna give you a big compliment, Dante. This was excellent. It's remarkable as an undergraduate student to give this clear, structured presentation on such an interesting topic. So I'm sure I speak on behalf of the people listening and on Gijs and Maaike to say that this was excellent and well done. I have a question for you. In terms of other, like, we know that people are sometimes not great at sort of detecting emotions, right? So is it anger or is it anxiety, or do people see disgust? You have other outcome variables other emotions that you measured, and do you find similar patterns, or is it really just a pattern for anger and not for, say, things that people often closely related to that, like anxiety and disgust?
Yeah, we just went ahead with the 6 basic emotions that we used initially. We didn't really delve deeper into like any further subset of emotions, but yeah, that might have a place in future study. Indeed, it is difficult for people to really differentiate, as we saw, between anger and disgust, right? The facial features could end up looking quite similar, even though someone is angry or disgusted. So there's also just a bit of unclarity there.
But to add, yeah, it would also be interesting because now we only manipulated anger. We could also manipulate other emotions and see if there's a different perception, maybe sadness, maybe if female politicians display, if they're crying, maybe they're perceived as way more emotional than male politicians. But yeah, we really focused on anger in this project so far.
In the absence of other questions, I have another question. So, what, this is always the standard political science question in a seminar, but why is it important that we know about this finding, and what does this teach us about the human psyche or the political dimensions of sort of emotions?
Well, what does this say? Yeah, I mean, I guess you could draw the analysis here that what people see on television, what people see on social media, how politicians communicate with us is via media, right? So oftentimes you just see a politician, just a talking head, and this research is important because perhaps the way in which one politician holds their facial features, or the way that they hold their mouth even, can just influence people's perception of whether or not they are legitimate, or whether or not they have something important to say. And of course, the differences here between genders, the sex difference is of course major, because we've been so used to seeing men as politicians, and as women come onto the political stage and take on positions of power, it's important to analyze whether or not there is a ingrained sex difference, and whether or not we're biased towards seeing women in a certain way. And of course, this has wide-ranging implications for female politicians themselves. If this research is indeed the way that we think it is, then we're able to see perhaps that women need to take on a different stance in politics in order to maintain respect and authority. So.
And so now you've given people politicians that they don't know. What would happen in a more high information environment? Do you expect these effects to wash out, become stronger, stay the same?
Yeah, that's, I mean, just for the purposes of our own research, it was important to make sure that we had these clear, kind of neutral, no extra information pictures and conditions. And I think in the future studies, we're going to, I think the idea is to add a bit more information to see if this is also the case, because right now, yeah, we're not able to really to see what the results of that would be. I think, of course, that it's dependent on how you yourself are interpreting a politician's message. If you are primed, for example, to find a certain female politician as legitimate and, you know, having certain authority and credibility, then you might already be primed to see her expression in a certain way. But
yeah, maybe a suggestion. Some of the work by Lasse Loutse has shown that they've started to vary the extent of dominant facial characteristics among sort of backbenchers and more prominent politicians, and they in their effect, the effects wash out a little bit. But that might be a design to have a look at once you start varying the extent to which people are known. That would be a nice addition. There's a question from Sanne van Oosten. Hi Dante, this is really impressive. I was not able to do this as an undergrad. I agree with that, Sanne. I'm very curious what underlying mechanisms you expect behind your outcomes. So why do you find what you find? You've hinted at this a bit, but I was wondering whether you can tell us a bit more about this.
Micah, maybe you can touch a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've been a little bit more researching the literature as well. And so there's lots of work actually by Ursula Hess, who presented last week. And what she says is that although we have the facial features, like men have more facial features that are similar to anger, such as thick eyebrows or thicker nose and just more angry looking, compared to women that are in general more baby face, which is more similar to happiness. That's what's in general the research among around emotion perception finds. What Ursula has shown is that it also, besides facial features, it's also very important, our stereotypes, our expectations of dominance. So these can actually overrule these facial features. And what I'm thinking is, especially with politicians, that if female politicians show anger, because mostly women aren't supposed to be super angry, we are super sensitive to it. So then we pick up it maybe quicker and more intensely. Whereas for male politicians, it's maybe more usual to show anger. So something maybe along those lines. But yeah, we really have to, we want to do a third study to also look more into this, maybe even measure some stereotypes, something like that. But yeah, that's, I think, a little bit the background, especially from Ursula Hess's work, how she would explain it, I think.
Great. There's a question from Isabella Ribasso. Thanks for this great presentation, awesome project. Maybe I missed this, but I was wondering if respondents knew that they were rating politicians. So is this an effect of people knowing that they're rating somebody in a position of power, or is this effect specific to politicians? Would you expect the same effects for female CEOs, for instance?
If I remember correctly, and I don't know about the first study, I can't remember that far back, but I'm pretty sure in this one we did indeed prime them by saying this is, we gave them a brief sentence saying, you know, something like view these politicians delivering remarks after some sort of debate or something. So we did prime a little bit our participants.
Yeah, we want to do that in the third study, that we then have like a condition in which we say these are, people with other jobs, like normal people, not politicians, or maybe even also indeed female or male CEOs or other dominant position, and see if it's really like this politician effect. And also, the difference between a dominant position and a non-dominant position, and if this bias then changes. So, yeah, that's very interesting, I think.
Sanne has a follow-up regarding low information context of the experiment, would it be ethically justified to alter the facial expressions of existing politicians and see how it would play out given a more high information environment than this low information experiment? That seems a question.
What was the last part, Bert?
Sorry, compared to the low information environment.
But for who was the question?
For Micah, maybe, that given that you have actually started manipulating some existing politicians.
Yeah. No, so first of all, these pictures are also actual politicians in this study. But the nice thing about these politicians is that all the pictures are taken from the same angle, same photograph, same lighting, etc. And they have a license, a copyright license, which says that we are free to use them and also manipulate them or transform them in any way. So we're really good with that. But yeah, in more high information settings, of course, it would be really cool to be able to do that. But it's very hard because if you, for example, have videos of speeches of politicians, then you would have to alter a moving face, which is also talking. And well, I've been trying to use deepfake, but deepfakes, it's really developing. It's becoming more and more accurate, but it's very hard if you're not a computer scientist or have a really good computer with a good video card. So it's definitely something that's cool to do, but it's more complicated, and especially for a sort of more controlled design, especially also if you want to sort of control the level of just the angle and the information and just focus only on an emotion. It's quite complex, but definitely something interesting to think about.
To add one thing to that, the ethical component, it's important to debrief people, obviously, at the end of the survey, that the faces they've seen are from real politicians, but they've been manipulated.
Yeah, and maybe also, I guess the other thing to add here, as somebody says who's in an ethics committee, is that if you're manipulating smiles and frowns, these are things that politicians probably show at times. So we're just gaining some causal control. It's not that we let them do or say things that are completely wrong. That's where deep fakes are a lot more tricky, and where the debriefing needs to be a lot more powerful in a sense than a controlled smile or angry. With disgust, it might start to maybe already, you might need to correct that a little stronger. Yeah, it's a good question, Sanne, and an important one, right, to deal with. There's another question. Great, thanks, Isabella. Adding two follow-ups here. You could also consider manipulating position of power independently of profession. So politician, non-politicians. For instance, a local candidate of an opposition party is in politics, but arguably doesn't have too much power. That's the first suggestion.
Yeah, interesting.
See you nodding.
Yeah, no, that's a good suggestion. That would be interesting. I think, I think we also talked about this doing something similar like that. But yeah, indeed, that you still have the same position, so still politicians, but one has more dominance and power than the other. So that's, I think that's interesting.
Also, maybe to note, that's why we decided to use the list of politicians that we did, because they were relatively obscure. I mean, I don't think anyone can name one single lord from the House of Lords. And we didn't use any super popular MPs as well. So maybe for the future.
Yeah. Second point from Isabella. As I understood, you had to choose pictures in which people aren't really smiling. Is it possible that female politicians who, despite strong social norms to smile, differ in significant ways from other female politicians for instance, dominance?
I can answer this one, because I also helped Izzy and I did most of these selections, and it was very hard to find neutral pictures, indeed, because a lot of these female politicians are smiling. These are portrait pictures, of course, so it's quite normal to smile. But I think we had more than 600 pictures, and when I run them through FaceReader, only around 20 or 25 were selected as neutral. But when we looked in it more, we saw also some other, so face reader is also not completely accurate. So we also found some other pictures, but yeah, it could be, it's like, yeah, maybe the female politicians who are not smiling are have a particular look, or there is something about them that could yeah, make them different than female politicians who are smiling. Yeah, Isabella and I also talked about this. We thought we could maybe use these pictures of existing databases, not from politicians, and saying this is a politician and who's looking neutral or angry, or yeah, some other ways. But yeah, it might be, it's hard to find good neutral pictures for female politicians. So that's definitely one of the limitations here. But yeah, something we also want to look into, whether their facial features differ and their just general impression differ from other politicians or normal non-politicians.
Okay. I think it's close to 4:30.
Yeah.
Let me, Dante, give you one more compliment. I think also the way you handled the Q&A at a very professional level. I think some of us and other people in academia can take an example of answering questions in seminars in such a kind and to the point manner. So my big compliments, and I hope to see more of you in the future, either here in the lab or at other places where life will bring you.
Thank you again, and also just want to give a shout out to all of the other people who worked on this project. So they're not here, but they're listening in the comments section. So thanks, guys.
Okay, and with that, we've come to the end of this mini conference, and I just want to end with announcing our schedule for the next few weeks, and where all of you are, of course, welcome to join us again. Again, Friday from 3 to 4. Next meeting is December 4 with Marieke van der Velde, with joint work with Maurits Meijers on compromises between political parties and coalition formation. Then the week after that, Patrick Stewart, December 11, again 3 to 4. His talk is titled "Facing Farage: Using the Computational Processing Model of Emotion to Understand UK and US Citizen Appraisal of Immigration Arguments." And then the week after that, we have another Graduate Friday with 2 talks, one by Maaike Homan on facial mimicry, and the second one, actually, I again don't see it on the website. We had this, so there's this weird thing that I don't see this talk on the website, but others do. So, but I think, what's his name, Bert, the other speaker?
Can Sengis
Can.
from Temple University.
Yes.
It is happening. It is
happening. So if you don't see it on the website, there is actually a meeting on the 18th. This is this really weird thing. And then, of course, we'll be meeting lots of times also in next year, in 2021. And Bert and I are producing the schedule. We're hoping to launch it next week. And I think we'll have an exciting schedule for you with talks, for example, by Jif Lelkus. I think that's the first one.
Yes.
I'm just opening the document. It's a bit slow. Yeah, Jif Lelkus, the first one on January 8th. Ursula Duxiker from University of Amsterdam, the 15th. Leor Schmiskrot from Cambridge. And then again, a Graduate Friday with Tristan Klingelhover and Lynn Andrea Fick. But many more speakers. I see Jana Krupnikov, Michael Brudner, Gerben van Kleef, Diamantis Petropoulos Pitalas, Teresa Kuhn, Cameron Brick, and I will hope to confirm 2 more speakers this week. So that's it for today. I want to thank you all for listening, and hope to see you next week.